Hi there, I'm Jen. This is Remembered Reads. Happy New Year. This is going to be a wrap-up of some of my fiction reading from the end of 2022, and I may sarcastically, call this something along the lines of heavy-handed messaging in fiction or something like that. The last piece of fiction that I read in 2022 was Scholastique Mukasonga's Kibogo. This is not translated by the usual translator of her work, which is interesting. So it has a bit of a different voice, but it may not be a choice of hers. That may just be the different translator. This was put out by Archipelago Press, and I had requested a review copy back in the summer and just got around to reading it. And it is essentially a 4-part story, but not in the short story sense, in that it is a single tale, not because the characters are necessarily repeating, but because the theme is repeating. And the theme that's running through it is essentially the cultural interweaving of the ascension stories that are present in Rwandan folk beliefs and in Roman Catholicism. And so you go forward from about the colonial point post First World War, when they're switching from German rule to Belgian rule, and then going forward in both conversion and kind of reconversion to folk belief and the interweaving of Catholicism and folk belief into something new, and how that plays out both socially and politically. And it's essentially a satire that is told in parts, very obviously, mimicking an oral storytelling tradition where you can potentially have different storytellers having a different spin on it. And at one point in the book, that even happens literally, where there are 2 old men being interviewed by a professor, and they're sort of both trying to one-up each other and telling the stories and making them sometimes more extreme, sometimes more in line with what they think the professor wants to hear, what's going to get them bigger benefits. Is he going to pay you more if you tell him the story he wants to hear? But even when it is not explicitly the 2 elders telling their stories, you do have the same kind of stylistic feeling that you're getting storytelling that's sort of the game of telephone that oral storytelling is, where everyone puts their own spin on something, and what are the different biases that are playing into that, or the different sets of beliefs that people are bringing into it. So that's all really fun. It is heavy-handed in parts in a way that I think, unfortunately, it kind of has to be, because it's the kind of story where if it weren't heavy-handed, you feel like a lot of readers would be bringing in the wrong piece of history to it. So, for example, the professor character that I talked about is almost over-the-top or ridiculous caricature, but if he weren't, is there a good set of the audience that wouldn't understand what they were reading otherwise? And I think that's kind of an interesting question that you bring into it at a kind of a meta level, to say, if this was for a narrower audience, that would be ridiculous and would be a negative. But I don't think it's meant for a narrow audience. I think there's a hope that this is for a broader audience, and so it has to be sort of a more extreme caricature, because otherwise people aren't going to get it. So reading it, I didn't think this was as powerful as Mukasonga's other works, some of her short stories, some of her autobiographical work, or her work about her mother. But at the same time, I think because it is this satirical story, it will work for people who I think are uncomfortable with the personal elements that you get in her autobiographical work. And I think because some of the caricatures are taken to a slightly more extreme, I think it makes it a little bit more universal. So it's not expecting, do you know this about Rwandan history, or specifically about the religious elements of Belgian colonial rule and whatnot. You could read this and just have a general idea of how did colonialism work in any imperial system, and you could still read this and get kind of the same thing out of it. So that is both a pro and a con, depending on how you are looking at this and how you're going to, and what you're going to compare it to, and what cultural baggage you're bringing into it and whatnot. In any case, worth reading. All of her stuff is worth reading. But yes, if you haven't read her Cockroaches, you should read that. Next up, as part of my translation project, I read Abdellah Taïa's A Country for Dying, pour mourir, which the English version is translated by Emma Ramadan, who does, I think, the most loyal translations I've read of any of the books that I've been reading lately to do original/translation comparisons with. It is almost as word for word as you can get, considering some of the grammatical differences between English and French and whatnot. The only places where things were significantly changed was there is one character who is in the midst of a gender transition, and because that is talked about differently in French, she changes some of the way that's framed, and I think it is purely because it's meant in a neutral way in the original, and so to make it neutral in English, you have to change a little bit more. So that's kind of interesting at a social level. In terms of story, this is basically the interweaving stories of a couple of sex workers. One is a Moroccan woman, one is an Algerian trans woman, and then we have a couple of other characters who kind of weave in and out. There is at one point a Iranian refugee who's briefly in France before he's moving to Scandinavia, and just the interweaving lives of these people. This is a book that Jen, the librarian, and Greg from Supposedly Fun had in their book club. I don't think it was the central choice for whichever month it was. I think it was the secondary choice because their book club has two. But if you're not following them, they have a Discord where everybody talks about these. I know when I popped into there, only a couple of people had read this one, I think because it was the secondary choice. And I enjoyed this. I sat down and read it all at once. It's a compelling peek into people's minds, because what you're getting is essentially not even so much moments in their life, but moments in their thought processes. So how they're thinking about their life choices, the people that they interact with. And you get bits and pieces of the interactions with each other, but it's very moment in memory. And I thought that was really interesting. And interestingly, I've read a few other things from this author, and his other work that I've read has all been far more autobiographical than this is. So that's kind of interesting externally, just to compare how he's writing about people who are obviously not himself versus when he's writing autofiction, which is what virtually everything else that I've read from him has been. I can't say a lot about it. It is an extremely short book, So in between those, I listened to an audiobook, which I think may have been the wrong choice for this particular book. And that was Noor Naga's If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English, which I think was on the list for the Giller Prize this year. So I think a lot of people were reading it who follow that prize. This is a book where I appreciated what the author was trying to do, but it just didn't work for me. But also I have read interviews with her that made me wonder if she was doing this to appease people who had had comments about her earlier work, Wash His Praise, where she'd said that she'd had family members who complained about the ending. So the ending in this book then takes a meta twist. I don't think it's a twist. People have talked about this, that you get two parts of a story, which is an Egyptian American girl who moves to Egypt and frames it as back, even though she's never lived there before. And she's very I was going to say middle class. Her family is rich, and she ends up having an affair with this Egyptian boy who is in the lower classes. He becomes unhoused in the bit, and at one point he's an addict and living on the street and sleeping in mosques because he's lost his house and because he's no longer has access to the shack that he had been paying for before. And so there is some interesting commentary about both class and the kind of class implications of people from the diaspora coming back to a country and that kind of thing, and kind of the politics of the post-spring Egypt, and how a lot of people who thought things were going to improve in one way didn't. So if they were wealthy enough to leave, they left. So someone who was born overseas coming back is in itself a kind of expression of a privilege that a lot of people in the country would react to differently, and also, cultural levels. What do you consider yourself in this country versus that country? All of which is an interesting enough discussion. The relationship in it reminded me a lot of the one in Leila Rafei's Spring, which is set during the protests, so in 2011, and has a similar U.S. student, although not of Egyptian heritage in that case, with a local Egyptian guy who is of a higher social class than the character in this. But despite those differences, a lot of the messaging is really similar in terms of their dynamic together and their dynamic in the relationship. However, once it gets to the third section, in which it turns into a piece of metafiction, because then we're getting a writing class in which the author is a character but not herself. So it's a version of herself that is not the same nationality or background, and it's presented as that version of her, or that fictional version of her was writing autofiction. And this isn't autofiction because her family history is different than this. And it's kind of poking at, what does the reader think? And does the reader think these things that these characters pointed out? And if not, what does that mean? And that's kind of interesting, but I personally found it eye-rolling. And most of the characters in that felt like caricatures. Now, as I said with Kibogo, sometimes that's necessary because I think people don't have enough of the history and they don't know what they're looking at. And if you make it a caricature, they connect into it more. And I suppose that's a fair argument, but I really thought that that didn't work because, like I have read, as I said, I've read other books that did very similar things and didn't feel the need to do that. And I don't think that improved it. Now, this is one of these things that I have seen people who had glowing reviews, which are significantly based on the fact that that final section is there. So that I think is going to come down to a lot, to taste, to what other things you've read on this theme and how close were they and did you like that more? And so this seems excessive and masturbatory, or are you hoping for this kind of thing? Do you like writers groups? Because that's something I say all the time. I don't want to read about your MFA experience. So if you turn this novel that was at least, about interesting topics, even if I wasn't 100% on, and you turn this into, let's pretend we're in a writing class. No, I don't want to read that. So for me, this was heavy-handed in a way that I thought didn't work, but your mileage may vary because that's very much taste-based. Yeah, I wasn't a fan of the final third, found it kind of eye-rolling. All right, and so finally was Agustina Bazterrica's Tender is the Flesh, which should be called Exquisite Corpses in English. I don't know why it isn't. That would be a literal translation of the title. Every other translation I've seen uses that because in the book there's a game that kids play that's called Exquisite Corpses. It also, why is the title this? Anyway, this is translated by Sarah Moses. And this is a book that everybody was talking about when it was translated into English 2 years ago. It was originally published in Spanish in 2017. And I had put off reading it because the central concept sounded like something that I wasn't going to be able to accept. It's set in a near future dystopia where, and this is what everybody mentions in the reviews, a virus has made all animals inedible to humans except humans. So humans are being factory farmed. And every time I heard that, I thought, that is nonsense. There's no disease that would impact a chimpanzee and a fish, but not humans. Like the biology doesn't make any sense, right? And the issue that I thought I was going to have with that and the believability of that is broken down pretty early because it's presented as this is not a real virus. This is a political thing that all of the governments in the world are playing into as population control. And so that's talked about in the book. Maybe not as much as it should be, because I still see people talking about this as though the virus is real. And this is not a spoiler. It's in the first chapter that people doubt this. And as you go on, you hear more and more people doubting it. So while that solved the issue that I thought I was going to have with this, it does bring in another issue, which is, and especially since now we've watched the whole COVID thing happen and we know that how people behave and how people can be deniers even when their grandfather just died of COVID, right? And so here we have this world where this virus is almost definitely fake, right? It makes no sense biologically, so even if we're saying it's a fantasy world, so that would work, the people in the world frequently don't believe it. So we have to believe that all these people went and, for example, killed their pets. And there's a bit where somebody says, oh, a lot of people took their dogs, their cats, their horses out of the city. But the main character who we're focused on, who works in the factory farming of humans industry, and he talks about how he euthanized his dogs and buried them. And I just thought, people won't even wear a mask to not kill their grandmother, right? I don't believe for a second that everybody in the entire world is euthanizing their pets, especially considering how many people like animals more than people, right? I did not believe the world state. So anyway, we open with this story. To get to some of the heavy-handed stuff, there is a scene in this where the main character is trying to hire a couple of new people for the abattoir, industrial abattoir that he works at. And he walks them through. And this reminded me of, I don't know if you've ever watched, it reminded me of these things where they change one thing about a play, like when somebody sets Taming of the Shrew, but they switch the genders, or they do Othello and they switch the colors or something like that. And that doesn't really do as much as people seem to think it does. And that's what that is. It might even be exactly the same as the abattoir sections in Animal Liberation, except it's people. And reading that, I just thought, twofold, it seems to be set up as, oh, isn't this horrific? And I'm reading it and thinking, well, I don't know, I read a lot about war crimes. I have read about people being skinned alive, and like it actually happens. It doesn't need to be this, haha, look at the factory farms. Like, come on. And so it felt lazy because it felt like, look how quickly we could move into this. And it's like, we have already moved into this, and people aren't even eating those people that they're torturing by skinning them alive, you know? The people in this book aren't being skinned alive. They're being shocked and bled out first. Yeah, so it made me think of that sex swap Taming of the Shrew, where it's like, you haven't actually changed the messaging of this story. It's the same. This isn't as clever as you think it is. So that annoyed me. It also feels in parts, there's one section where they're talking about leatherwork, and I thought, this author doesn't understand how leatherwork works, because the way they're talking about, color and scar tissue and stuff, this is not how leatherwork works. Also, the fact that they're branding this, like, you have scar tissue on them. What do you think that is? It's all at odds with each other. It's not a believable world state. It's also, they're doing experimentation on these farmed humans, and they're like and they add in some echoes of Mangala, or there's a thing where they're talking about importing, and it's based on color, and so echoes of the transatlantic slave trade. And reading that, I thought of, you know, the PETA ads where they compare chicken farming to the Holocaust, and you think, I don't know if you realize what you're doing, but it's not what you think you're doing. That's what the messaging in this is like. It also felt like having a conversation with the kind of vegan who says, if they put the name of the cow on the meat package, no one would eat meat. You know, and then people will come in and say, actually, I've eaten goats that I knew personally and grew up with, because like the cultural assumptions don't line up together. And I think it's such a shame, because here's the thing, you're factory farming people. So the implication is that there's some class of people that could have been brought forward as like, these are people that aren't human, we can eat them. And there's some plays on this where they talk about, some Bolivian immigrants came in and they got eaten, and maybe these, you know, you could be punished by being eaten. But it doesn't really dig into that, and I think that would be a lot more interesting in terms of society building. Like, what had to happen to get everybody to kill their pets? What had to happen for people to decide which class of people was going to be food worthy? But the book is not interested in any of that. The book seems to think that if you swap out an abattoir story about cows and you make it people, that somehow that's a deep statement. And it's not. That's lazy. So I was reading this and thinking, this annoys me on every level other than the one I thought it was going to annoy me on. So the virus thing, not annoying because that turned out to not be real, but I just did not believe that the entire world, because that's a big thing, right? Like, different cultures are going to react to things differently. You could have that. And I mean, especially like this author's from Argentina. It's set in Argentina. You know, this is a post-colonial settler state. You can have metaphors about what happened to the indigenous people. You can have metaphors about what happened to the children of the disappeared who were adopted into, you know, political families during the dictatorship, right? You could have all kinds of metaphors for things that happened there, for things that happened in other countries, other than the heavy-handed two things about like the Holocaust and the transatlantic slave trade, which again, heavy-handed, you could have something deeper. And it just doesn't. And I thought, this is lazy. This could have been so much better. So I don't know. I've seen a lot of people who said that they loved this, and that makes no sense to me. Unless you are genuinely the kind of vegan who's like, you wouldn't eat cows if you knew their name. And then anyone who grew up on a farm or hunts says, you know, actually, I did know the goat that I had for dinner. Because it just, well, it's like there are two cultural stances and you're not talking to each other. So, and I mean, again, whatever, that's fine. It works for some people. I have since seen a few people review this more recently and not like it, but you know, I just thought it didn't work. There's supposedly a twist at the end, but I did not think it was a twist because it is very predictable, because the main character at one point has one of these food humans living in his house, and what happens is exactly what you think is going to happen given his family history. It's like, okay, his wife is not living with him right now because she's sad because they had a child die. What do you think is going to happen? The exact thing that you think is going to happen is what happens here. So, I mean, that might be slightly a spoiler, but it shouldn't be, because this is like heavy-handed nonsense. I'm sorry. Try harder. There's an idea here, but it's so surface level that it's nonsense. It's like, come on. So yeah, let's cut that off here. I could rant about this forever, I think, just because so many people gave this glowing reviews, and just because I was expecting to have trouble with this one element, and instead that was fine. Everything else was an issue. But anyway, if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. If you disagree with me with Tender as the Flesh, which I'm sure lots of people do, feel free to argue with me in the comments. Anyway, that's it for now. Happy New Year. Ciao.